You are listening to Nighttime Documentaries. The silent activity of the brain at rest. During sleep, especially in the deepest stages, the brain does not shut down or go blank. In fact, even though the body appears to be still, neuronal activity follows its own pattern, which is slower and more coordinated. Neurons begin to fire electrical impulses rhythmically, forming broad, slow waves that travel through different regions of the brain. These waves do not seek to react to the environment, but rather to maintain stable internal communication, almost like a constant murmur that does not require conscious attention. In this same state, the brain reduces the influence of the areas responsible for decision-making and conscious control, such as the prefrontal cortex, and allows other regions to express themselves more freely. This does not happen abruptly, but gradually, accompanying the decrease in heart rate and muscle relaxation. The feeling of disconnection is not an absence, but a reorganization of the flow of information. Meanwhile, certain deep structures, such as the thalamus, act as a stricter filter, limiting the input of external stimuli. Sounds, lights, and sensations from the environment continue to arrive, but they are attenuated before reaching consciousness. This function allows the brain to maintain a state of prolonged stability, without unnecessary disturbances, promoting the continuity of sleep. Similarly, the neural networks that process complex information during the day synchronize into simpler patterns. This synchrony does not imply inactivity, but rather a different form of efficiency. By reducing variability, the brain can devote resources to internal tasks that require time and repetition. In many cases, this activity is related to the maintenance of connections, chemical regulation, and the overall balance of the nervous system. Over time, this type of functioning is repeated night after night, creating an internal rhythm that the brain recognizes and expects. The regularity of sleep allows these phases to flow smoothly, and when that happens, the transition from one stage to another feels natural, almost automatic. Thus, the brain learns to rest without stopping working, maintaining a delicate balance between silence and activity. Furthermore, this silent activity has a cumulative effect. It is not an isolated event, but a continuous process that builds slowly. Each night, the brain adjusts small details, reinforces certain patterns, and smooths out others. This discrete work lays the foundation for the processes that unfold later, when sleep becomes even deeper and more stable. The internal order of memories during sleep. As rest deepens, the brain begins to interact with memories in a particular way. It does not do so consciously or in an organized manner as it does during the day, but rather by following internal associations that are activated spontaneously. In this state, recent and older memories can coexist in the same network of activity, connecting without any obvious logic from the outside. During these phases, the hippocampus, a key structure in memory, communicates intensely with the cerebral cortex. This communication occurs in repetitive, slow, and constant cycles. The goal is not to relive experiences, but to reorganize stored information. Gradually, certain memories are reinforced, while others lose intensity, as if the brain were adjusting the volume of each one. In many cases, this reorganization does not consciously distinguish between what is important and what is trivial. The criterion is neither emotional nor rational, but functional. Frequently used connections tend to stabilize, while less active ones weaken slightly. This process occurs effortlessly, accompanied by the same slow waves that dominate deep sleep. Furthermore, the brain does not store memories as isolated units. During sleep, fragments of information are integrated into broader networks. A sound, an image, or a sensation can become associated with different contexts, enriching the overall structure of memory. This integration happens slowly, following the internal rhythm of the sleeping brain. On the other hand, this nighttime work does not generate a clear narrative. There is no story that is ordered from beginning to end, but rather multiple simultaneous adjustments. Each brain region contributes its own activity, and the whole remains stable thanks to overall synchronization. In this way, the brain avoids overload and allows changes to be distributed evenly. Over time, this repeated process makes information more accessible during wakefulness. However, during sleep there is no intention to learn or remember. Everything happens as a natural consequence of the state of deep rest. The brain simply takes advantage of the absence of stimuli to reorganize itself internally. Meanwhile, emotional memories are also adjusted. The areas related to emotions reduce their intensity, allowing certain experiences to lose their emotional charge. This adjustment does not erase what happened, but softens its impact, integrating it more neutrally into the set of memories. The gradual cleansing of the brain while we sleep. In that same state of deep rest, another process takes place constantly and silently. The brain activates a cleaning system that works mainly during sleep. This system allows the elimination of metabolic waste that accumulates during the day, when neuronal activity is most intense. During wakefulness, the space between brain cells is smaller. However, while we sleep, that space expands slightly, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flow more freely. This slow, continuous movement carries away substances that are no longer needed, facilitating their elimination. Similar to other bodily processes, this cleansing does not occur all at once. It is a gradual, constant movement that depends on the rhythm of sleep. The slow waves that characterize the deep phases favor this flow, creating a stable environment for the process to continue without interruption. Furthermore, this system does not consciously distinguish between types of waste. It simply responds to the overall accumulation. The more regular the rest, the more efficient this mechanism becomes. Therefore, the brain tends to repeat these patterns every night, adjusting its functioning to the duration and depth of sleep. In many cases, this cleansing contributes to the feeling of clarity that comes after a long rest. It is not an immediate or intense sensation, but rather a general state of balance. By freeing up space and regulating its internal chemistry, the brain prepares to process information again with greater stability. Meanwhile, support cells, known as glia, actively participate in this process. They do not remain passive during sleep, but regulate the neuronal environment, ensuring that the flow of fluids and substances remains within stable parameters. Their work is constant and discrete, accompanying the general rhythm of the sleeping brain. Over time, this nightly maintenance becomes an essential part of brain function. It requires no attention or conscious effort. It simply happens, night after night, as a natural consequence of deep rest. And as these processes continue silently, the brain remains in that calm state, linking one phase to another, setting the stage for the curiosities that continue to slowly emerge in the same continuous flow of sleep. That continuous flow does not stop, it simply changes in nuance. The brain, still immersed in that stable rest, moves from more physical and maintenance processes to internal dynamics that have to do with perception, time, and identity, even though everything happens without consciousness or intention. The perception of time in the sleeping brain. While the body remains still and the environment remains almost unchanged, the brain profoundly modifies the way it processes time. During sleep, especially in the deepest stages, the structures responsible for measuring the duration and sequence of events reduce their usual activity. There is no clear timeline, nor a sense of before and after as there is during wakefulness. Time, in this state, becomes diffuse, extended, almost suspended. This change does not occur abruptly. As sleep progresses, the internal signals that mark the passage of time become less precise. The brain stops registering short, repetitive intervals, such as seconds or minutes, and adapts to broader, slower cycles. Brain waves mark this rhythm, creating a uniform cadence that does not need external references. In this same state, the internal clocks that regulate attention and anticipation are partially silenced. During the day, these functions allow us to anticipate what comes next, but during sleep they are no longer necessary. The brain does not expect anything, does not plan, does not anticipate. It simply remains in a continuous present, sustained by the rhythmic activity of its internal networks. Similarly, this alteration of temporal perception explains why, upon awakening, rest can feel brief or long without any direct relation to its actual duration. The brain has not recorded the passage of time in a linear fashion, but rather as a succession of stable states. Each phase integrates into the next without a clear boundary, creating a sense of immeasurable continuity. In addition, this partial suspension of time facilitates other internal processes. Not being subject to a strict sequence, the brain can reorganize information without the pressure of a chronological order. Memories, sensations, and associations move more freely, adjusting according to their functional affinity rather than their temporal location. Over time, this mode of operation becomes familiar to the brain. Night after night, it repeats this pattern, recognizing rest as a space without temporal urgency. This repetition reinforces the stability of sleep and allows the brain to remain in that state for extended periods without interruption. Meanwhile, the body accompanies this rhythm. Breathing, pulse, and temperature synchronize with this altered perception of time, creating a coherent environment. Everything moves slowly, with no need to move toward any specific place. The diminishing sense of self during sleep. As the brain deepens into rest, another silent transformation takes place. The areas responsible for self-perception, those that sustain the sense of continuous identity, gradually reduce their activity. The self that organizes thoughts, decisions, and memories during the day loses prominence, leaving room for more distributed and less centralized functioning. This process does not involve a complete disappearance, but rather a gradual dilution. The brain regions that integrate personal experience cease to actively coordinate information. Instead, each system works more independently, following internal patterns without the need for constant supervision. In many cases, this diminution of the sense of self is reflected in the absence of internal dialogue. The voice that comments, evaluates, or anticipates during wakefulness becomes increasingly faint. The brain does not need to explain what is happening because there is no conscious experience to interpret. Everything happens without narration. Similarly, emotions lose their personal reference. They are not felt as one's own reactions, but as diffuse states that integrate and adjust without resistance. The emotional areas remain active, but are no longer linked to an identity that observes or judges them. Furthermore, this reduction of the self facilitates brain flexibility. By not being focused on maintaining a coherent image of itself, the brain can reorganize its networks with greater freedom. Connections adjust according to their functional usefulness, not according to their relationship to a personal story. This process repeats itself every night, training the brain in the ability to let go of conscious control. This constant practice requires no effort because it occurs automatically upon entering deep sleep. The brain recognizes this state as safe and stable. Meanwhile, this temporary dissolution of the self leaves no conscious trace. Upon awakening, identity is quickly reconstructed, resuming its usual references. However, during sleep, this partial absence allows for deeper and more uniform rest, without internal tensions. Internal communication between hemispheres during sleep. In that same continuous flow, the brain maintains a constant dialogue between its two hemispheres. Although during wakefulness each hemisphere may specialize in certain tasks, during sleep this division softens. Communication becomes more symmetrical, more rhythmic, less dependent on specific functions. Electrical signals cross back and forth through the corpus callosum following repetitive and stable patterns. They do not transmit detailed information about the environment, but rather general states of activity. This exchange allows both hemispheres to remain synchronized, preventing imbalances in their functioning. Gradually, this synchrony intensifies in the deeper stages of sleep. Slow waves appear almost simultaneously on both sides of the brain, creating a sense of functional unity. There is no competition or alternation, only a shared rhythm that is maintained for long periods. In addition, this communication facilitates the integration of processes that are more separate during the day. Analytical and associative functions can adjust to each other without the pressure of responding to external stimuli. The brain takes advantage of this opportunity to balance its internal systems. In many cases, this hemispheric dialogue contributes to emotional and cognitive stability. By sharing similar states of activity, the brain reduces the possibility of uneven activations that could disrupt sleep. Everything remains within a predictable and constant range. Meanwhile, this exchange requires no attention or awareness. It is an automatic process, sustained by the very structure of the brain. Night after night, it repeats itself as part of the overall maintenance of the nervous system. Over time, this silent communication becomes integrated into the set of processes that define deep rest. Without marking a clear beginning or end, the brain continues to adjust internally, linking one curiosity to the next, maintaining that uniform and unhurried tone that accompanies uninterrupted sleep. This internal adjustment continues without stopping, and within that same stable state, the brain deploys other functions related to regulating the body and maintaining overall balance while we sleep. Everything happens at the same constant slow pace, without sudden changes, as if each process knew its place within the whole. Automatic regulation of bodily functions. During sleep, the brain assumes a different control over the body's basic functions. It does not direct them with the conscious precision of wakefulness, but through automatic centers that work continuously and silently. Breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure are regulated according to simpler and more stable patterns, adapted to prolonged rest. This automatic control is supported by deep structures of the brain, such as the brain stem, which remains active even in the deepest stages of sleep. These regions do not require consciousness to function. They simply adjust bodily rhythms according to internal signals, responding slowly to changes without causing any sudden shocks. In this same state, the brain reduces variability. During the day, bodily rhythms fluctuate in response to the environment and emotions. While we sleep, these fluctuations are smoothed out. The body enters a narrower range of functioning, which promotes overall stability and reduces energy expenditure. Similarly, body temperature drops slightly. The brain adjusts this parameter without conscious intervention, facilitating a state of conservation. This decrease is not abrupt, but gradual, accompanying the transition to deep sleep and remaining constant throughout most of the night. In addition, this automatic regulation frees up brain resources. By not having to respond to external stimuli or coordinate complex movements, the brain can devote its activity to slower internal processes. Everything is kept in balance, without the need for active supervision. Over time, this pattern is reinforced. The brain learns to recognize sleep as a period of stable regulation and adjusts its responses to maintain it. Each night, this automatic control is activated more easily, provided that conditions are similar. Meanwhile, the body responds to these signals with progressive stillness. Muscles relax, postures are maintained for longer, and small movements are reduced. Everything contributes to sustaining that uniform state that characterizes deep rest. Reduced sensory sensitivity during sleep. As rest takes hold, the brain modifies the way it processes sensory information. The senses do not shut down, but their influence is greatly diminished. Sounds, lights, and tactile sensations continue to arrive, but their impact is attenuated before they reach the centers of conscious processing. This filtering occurs mainly in the thalamus, a structure that acts as a way station for sensory information. During sleep, the thalamus adjusts its functioning, limiting the amount of signals it transmits. It does not completely block out the environment, but it reduces its intensity, creating a kind of perceptual distance. Gradually, this reduction in sensitivity allows the brain to maintain sleep even in the presence of mild stimuli. A constant noise or dim light does not generate an immediate response. The brain automatically evaluates these signals and decides whether they deserve attention, which happens only in specific cases. Furthermore, this mechanism is not uniform. Some stimuli, such as repetitive sounds, become integrated into the background of the environment and lose relevance. Others, more abrupt, can pass through the filter and cause partial activation. However, even in these cases, the response is usually brief and contained. Over time, the brain becomes more efficient at this filtering. Accumulated experience allows it to distinguish familiar patterns from potential threats. This ability develops unconsciously, based on the nightly repetition of similar situations. Meanwhile, sensory reduction contributes to the continuity of rest. By decreasing the input of information, the brain can sustain its internal processes without frequent interruptions. Everything remains within a predictable and calm range. This state does not imply total isolation, but rather a different relationship with the environment. The brain is still present, but from a greater distance, allowing sleep to develop smoothly. Spontaneous creative activity in the sleeping brain. Within the same context of sensory reduction and automatic control, the brain retains a particular ability to generate internal combinations. Although there is no creative intention during deep sleep, neural networks can interact in unusual ways, giving rise to new and flexible associations. This type of activity does not respond to specific objectives or problems. It arises from the constant reorganization of connections. As conscious control decreases, the usual barriers between brain areas relax, allowing for freer exchanges. Similarly, regions that work separately during the day may coincide in shared patterns of activity. This coincidence does not seek a result, but it generates new configurations. Over time, some of these configurations may stabilize and become available for wakefulness. Moreover, this process occurs effortlessly. The brain does not need to concentrate or evaluate what it produces. It simply explores its own internal space, moving slowly between possible states. This exploration remains within stable limits, without intense activations. In many cases, this creative activity is related to the integration of diverse information. Sensations, memories, and patterns combine in ways that do not follow daytime logic. However, during deep sleep, these combinations are not consciously experienced. Meanwhile, the brain maintains its overall rhythm. Slow waves continue to mark internal time, ensuring that this spontaneous activity does not interrupt rest. Everything is integrated into the continuous flow of sleep. As the hours pass, these dynamics repeat themselves over and over again, with no clear beginning or defined end. The brain remains in this calm state, linking processes, adjusting functions, and preparing the ground for uninterrupted rest, always maintaining the uniform and constant tone that accompanies the night. This prepared ground remains stable, and within that stability other processes appear which, although less obvious, are part of the same slow and continuous movement of the brain while we sleep. Nothing interrupts, nothing accelerates, everything moves at the same uniform pace. Chemical modulation of the brain during sleep. While the brain remains at rest, its chemical activity changes in a sustained manner. The neurotransmitters that facilitate attention, alertness, and rapid response during wakefulness decrease in presence. Substances such as norepinephrine and serotonin gradually reduce their release, allowing the brain to adopt a more stable and less reactive state. This chemical adjustment does not occur all at once. As sleep progresses, concentrations change slowly, following the rhythm of the rest phases. The brain does not seek total silence, but rather a different balance, in which arousal remains low and constant. Similarly, other chemical messengers increase their influence. Melatonin, for example, accompanies this process by facilitating sleep continuity. It does not induce images or sensations, but simply reinforces the internal signal that it is time to remain at rest. In addition, this chemical modulation affects the way neurons communicate. Signals become more predictable, less variable. the brain reduces the likelihood of sudden activations, favoring a homogeneous internal environment. Over time, this chemical balance becomes a familiar pattern. The brain recognizes the sequence and adapts to it, adjusting its functioning with each night of regular rest. This repetition reinforces the overall stability of the nervous system. Meanwhile, these changes do not require conscious control. They occur as part of the basic physiology of sleep, sustaining that prolonged state of functional calm. The slow reorganization of sensory maps. In that same stable chemical state, the brain continues to adjust how it represents the body and the environment. Sensory maps, which are constantly updated with new information during the day, enter a phase of slow reorganization during sleep. The areas responsible for processing touch, position, and movement reduce their external activity. Internally, however, the connections between neurons are readjusted. This process does not respond to current stimuli, but to accumulated patterns of experience. Gradually, representations are refined. The most consistent connections are slightly strengthened, while others are weakened. This is not a visible change, but rather a fine-tuning that occurs over many nights. In addition, this reorganization contributes to bodily coherence. By keeping sensory maps aligned, the brain facilitates more stable perception upon awakening, even though there is no awareness of this during sleep. In many cases, this internal work is done in parallel with other processes. It does not interfere or compete, but rather integrates into the same general flow. Slow waves continue to set the pace, ensuring that everything remains within smooth parameters. Meanwhile, the body remains still, providing a stable environment for these maps to adjust without interruption. The brain takes advantage of this stillness to refine its internal representations. Rhythmic repetition as the basis for deep rest. Throughout sleep, one element remains constant: repetition. The brain uses rhythmic patterns to sustain its state of rest. These repetitions do not seek a specific result, but rather stability. Slow brain waves repeat over and over, creating broad, predictable cycles. Each cycle reinforces the next, generating an internal sense of continuity. The brain stays within that rhythm without the need for sudden readjustments. Similarly, many internal processes follow repeated sequences. Communication between regions, chemical regulation, and cellular cleansing are synchronized with these rhythms. Everything moves forward in a measured way. Over time, this repetition becomes deeply familiar to the brain. It recognizes the pattern as safe and efficient, and therefore tends to maintain it for long periods. Any deviation is usually corrected automatically. Meanwhile, this rhythmic foundation sustains uninterrupted rest. There are no highlights or peaks of activity. Everything glides smoothly along, allowing sleep to continue without the need for attention. And so, within that repeated, calm movement, the brain continues to move slowly from one process to another, maintaining the same uniform tone, allowing each curiosity to link to the next, as part of the same narrative that does not need to be noticed in order to continue flowing. That constant flow is not interrupted, it simply shifts to even more subtle functions, those that maintain the overall balance of the brain without being noticed. Everything continues at the same leisurely pace, as if each process knew exactly when and how to participate. The gradual disconnection of voluntary movement. As sleep deepens, the brain establishes a clear separation between mental activity and body movement. Although the motor areas continue to show some internal activity, the signals that would normally activate the voluntary muscles are blocked in a controlled manner. This blockage is not absolute from the outset, but rather occurs progressively. The structures responsible for this inhibition send constant signals to the spinal cord, reducing the muscle's ability to respond. The body remains in a state of functional stillness, not due to a lack of brain activity, but because of precise regulation that prevents unnecessary movements. Similarly, this mechanism does not seek to completely immobilize, but rather to maintain balance. Small postural adjustments can still occur, but slowly and to a limited extent. The brain prioritizes stability, ensuring that rest is not interrupted by involuntary actions. In addition, this disconnection from movement allows other areas of the brain to work without interference. By reducing the need to coordinate physical responses, the brain frees up resources for slower, more sustained internal processes. Over time, this pattern is reinforced. The brain learns to associate deep sleep with bodily stillness, integrating both states as part of the same physiological experience. Meanwhile, the muscles respond to this regulation by entering a state of prolonged relaxation. Tension decreases, and the body adapts to postures maintained without conscious effort. Brain activity in the absence of stimuli. In the almost total absence of relevant external stimuli, the brain does not remain inactive. On the contrary, it uses this condition to explore its own internal activity. Without having to respond to the environment, neural networks remain active within a reduced and predictable range. This state allows the brain to observe, so to speak, its own patterns. There is no consciousness to supervise, but connections are adjusted based on their previous functioning. The routes most used during the day tend to stabilize, while others are slowly reorganized. Gradually, this lack of stimuli promotes internal coherence. The brain does not need to react, only to maintain its balance. Each region finds its place within the whole, synchronizing with the others. In addition, this condition reduces the likelihood of erratic activations. With no new stimuli to process, the brain remains in familiar states, contributing to the continuity of sleep. Over time, this ability to function without external input becomes essential for deep rest. The brain recognizes sensory stillness as an opportunity to stabilize. Meanwhile, the environment remains in the background, present but distant, allowing the brain to continue its internal activity without interruption. The nocturnal adaptation of internal rhythms. Throughout sleep, the brain's internal rhythms are continuously adjusted. They do not remain fixed, but slowly adapt to the needs of the moment. These rhythms regulate everything from the release of chemicals to the intensity of neuronal activity. This adjustment does not respond to external signals, but to an internal clock that operates autonomously. The brain compares its current state with previous patterns and makes small changes to maintain balance. Similarly, these rhythms influence the transition between sleep phases. There are no sudden changes, only gradual shifts that are integrated into the overall flow. Each phase prepares for the next without interruption. In addition, this continuous adaptation allows the brain to respond to internal variations, such as changes in temperature or body chemistry, without disturbing rest. Everything is gently corrected. Over time, these rhythms synchronize with the daily cycle, reinforcing the regularity of sleep. The brain learns when to deepen and when to lighten its activity, always within stable limits. And so, while these adjustments continue to occur silently, the brain remains in that uniform state, linking one function to another, allowing rest to progress unhurriedly, sustained by repetition, stillness, and that constant internal movement that continues without needing to be observed. That internal movement continues without announcing changes, and within the continuity other processes appear that complete the silent landscape of the sleeping brain. Everything remains united by the same slow rhythm, without marked transitions, as if each function naturally slides into the next. How the brain adjusts its energy consumption. During sleep, the brain significantly modifies the way it uses its energy. Although it remains active, its energy demand is distributed more evenly. The areas responsible for attention, analysis, and rapid response reduce their consumption, while other regions maintain a constant and moderate expenditure. This adjustment does not imply a total reduction in energy use, but rather a reorganization. The brain prioritizes maintenance and regulation processes, avoiding unnecessary peaks. Gradually, consumption stabilizes at a lower level than during wakefulness, but sufficient to sustain all essential functions. In this same state, neurons change their firing pattern. Electrical signals become more rhythmic and less frequent, contributing to more efficient energy use. Each impulse is integrated into a collective pattern, avoiding isolated activations. In addition, this energy balance allows the brain to recover from the accumulated effort of the day. It is not a complete pause, but rather a change of pace. The nervous system takes advantage of this period to redistribute resources and prepare the ground for future activity. Over time, this pattern is reinforced night after night. The brain learns to anticipate rest and adjusts its metabolism accordingly. This predictability contributes to the overall stability of sleep. Meanwhile, the body accompanies this adjustment by reducing its own energy expenditure. The entire organism enters a conservation mode, coordinated by signals from the sleeping brain. Emotional stability without conscious content. During deep sleep, the areas of the brain related to emotions remain active, but their functioning changes significantly. Intense emotional reactions, which can be quickly triggered during the day, are considerably attenuated. The brain maintains a low and stable emotional tone. This state does not imply an absence of emotion, but rather constant regulation. Emotional structures exchange signals slowly, without generating marked responses. Fluctuations are smoothed out, creating a uniform background that does not require conscious interpretation. Similarly, the connections between emotion and memory are adjusted. Intense experiences lose some of their force, integrating more neutrally into the set of memories. This process occurs effortlessly and unintentionally, accompanied by the same slow rhythm of sleep. In addition, this emotional stability contributes to the continuity of rest. By reducing the likelihood of intense activations, the brain avoids unnecessary interruptions. Everything remains within predictable limits. Over time, this nocturnal regulation becomes an essential part of overall emotional balance. The brain learns to use sleep as a space for adjustment, where emotions are reorganized without pressure. Meanwhile, there is no subjective experience of this process. The brain simply maintains its activity within a calm range, allowing rest to continue without interruption. The silent integration of past experiences. Throughout sleep, the brain continues to integrate experiences accumulated over time. It does not do so consciously or selectively, but rather by following internal patterns of connection. Fragments of information are linked to existing structures, expanding networks of meaning without forming clear narratives. This process occurs slowly, respecting the general rhythm of rest. Associations are gradually strengthened or weakened, with no one standing out above the others. The brain seeks internal coherence, not immediate relevance. Similarly, past experiences are adjusted to new configurations. They are not actively reinterpreted, but rather relocated within a broader system. This silent adjustment allows accumulated knowledge to remain flexible. Furthermore, this integration does not distinguish between the recent and the old. Everything is part of the same dynamic whole. The brain takes advantage of the absence of current stimuli to reorganize its internal history. Over time, this ongoing work contributes to a general sense of continuity upon awakening. Although the process is not remembered, its effects are manifested in cognitive and emotional stability. And so, as these integrations continue to occur without pause, the brain remains immersed in that smooth, steady flow, linking one curiosity to the next, sustaining rest with the same slow cadence, allowing the night to progress without needing to be noticed. That silent progress does not stop, it only moves toward even deeper processes, those that sustain the overall coherence of the brain as rest continues. Everything remains united by the same slow cadence, without jolts, without clear marks of beginning or end. The global synchronization of the sleeping brain. During deep sleep, the brain tends to behave as a more integrated whole. Regions that function relatively independently during wakefulness begin to synchronize their activity. This synchronization does not seek immediate efficiency, but rather long-term stability. Slow waves spread across large areas of the brain, aligning the rhythm of millions of neurons. This phenomenon creates moments when large areas enter relative rest at the same time, followed by smooth, coordinated activations. The result is a global, broad, and uniform pattern. Similarly, this synchrony reduces internal noise. Isolated signals lose prominence, and the brain prioritizes collective activity. Each neuron integrates into a common rhythm, decreasing the likelihood of disordered activations. In addition, this coordination promotes efficient communication between distant regions. By sharing the same rhythm, the exchange of information becomes more predictable, even if it is not task-oriented. The brain remains cohesive. Over time, this synchronization reinforces the functional architecture of the nervous system. It does not introduce sudden changes, but rather consolidates existing patterns, ensuring that everything works harmoniously. Meanwhile, this state does not generate conscious experiences. It is a deep, structural process that sustains rest from within. The brain's adaptation to prolonged stillness. Over several hours of sleep, the brain adapts to the lack of movement and interaction with the environment. This stillness is not interpreted as an absence, but as a stable condition. The brain adjusts its activity to function within that framework. The areas responsible for planning actions and movements reduce their participation. With no need to anticipate responses, these regions enter a maintenance mode. They do not shut down, but simply operate at a minimum level. Gradually, this adaptation reduces internal tension. The brain stops preparing for immediate changes and settles into a state of continuity. Each moment resembles the previous one, reinforcing the feeling of physiological stability. In addition, this prolonged stillness allows internal signals to become clearer. By reducing interference from external stimuli and action plans, the brain can more accurately regulate its own states. Over time, this adaptation becomes an expectation. The brain recognizes sleep as a period without demands and adjusts its functioning to sustain it for hours. Meanwhile, the body remains motionless, accompanying this internal regulation without resistance. The continuity of the deep dream state. In the most stable phases of sleep, the brain enters a state that requires no images, narratives, or recognizable content. It is not a void, but a silent continuity. Activity is maintained, but without any notable forms. This state is characterized by the repetition of familiar patterns. The brain does not intensely explore new configurations, but rather reinforces those that are already stable. Everything moves within narrow margins. Similarly, the transitions between moments of greater and lesser activity are smooth. There are no jumps or interruptions. Each variation is integrated into the general flow, maintaining the same internal tone. In addition, this deep state protects rest. By not generating eye-catching content, it reduces the likelihood of activations that could lead to awakening. The brain remains comfortable in this uniformity. Over time, this continuity becomes the basis for prolonged rest. The brain does not need to change, only to remain. Each cycle reinforces the next. And so, while this stability is effortlessly sustained, the brain continues its slow and steady journey, linking processes, adjusting functions, allowing sleep to continue almost imperceptibly, like a continuous narrative that does not require attention to exist. That internal narrative continues to advance without the need to mark steps, and within that same stability, processes appear that operate at an even deeper, almost structural level, sustaining the brain's functioning as rest continues uninterrupted. The slow plasticity of the brain during sleep. During sleep, the brain retains its ability to change, but it does so at a different pace. Plasticity, which during wakefulness can respond quickly to new stimuli, takes on a slower and more stable form. It is not about learning something new, but about delicately adjusting what already exists. The connections between neurons are modified in subtle ways. Some are barely strengthened, others are weakened without disappearing. These changes do not seek to stand out, but rather to balance the whole. The brain observes its own patterns of use and makes small adjustments to maintain its internal coherence. Similarly, this process does not occur in a single region. Nocturnal plasticity is distributed across large areas, affecting entire networks rather than isolated connections. The result is a smooth and progressive global reorganization. Furthermore, this plasticity requires no effort or attention. It is activated as a natural part of the resting state. The brain takes advantage of the stability of sleep to allow changes that during the day could interfere with immediate functioning. Over time, these cumulative adjustments influence how the brain responds to the environment upon awakening. Although not directly perceived, they contribute to an overall sense of fluidity and balance. Meanwhile, this internal work continues without generating conscious signals, integrated into the same slow rhythm that sustains rest. The decrease in predictive activity. During wakefulness, the brain constantly anticipates what is going to happen. It generates predictions about the environment, the body, and future actions. During sleep, this predictive activity is significantly reduced. The brain stops projecting forward. This change is not sudden. As rest deepens, the areas responsible for anticipation decrease their influence. The brain no longer needs to anticipate responses because there are no external demands to attend to. Gradually, the mind settles into a continuous present, without expectations. Each moment stands on its own, without reference to what comes next. This absence of prediction reduces cognitive load and promotes stability. In addition, this reduction allows the brain to focus on internal processes without distractions. By not having to calculate future scenarios, it can devote its activity to regulation and maintenance. Over time, this suspension of anticipation becomes familiar. The brain recognizes sleep as a space without an immediate future and adapts to that condition. Meanwhile, this temporary stillness contributes to the depth of rest, maintaining the same uniform tone. The stability of internal language during deep sleep. In the deepest stages of sleep, internal language virtually disappears. The areas of the brain associated with verbal processing reduce their activity, ceasing to generate recognizable linguistic structures. This silence does not imply inactivity, but rather a reorganization. The networks that support language remain connected, but no longer produce sequences. The brain does not need words to operate in this state. Similarly, this absence of language contributes to the continuity of sleep. By not forming sentences or concepts, the possibility of conscious activations is reduced. In addition, this linguistic pause allows other forms of processing to develop without interference. The brain communicates with itself through rhythms and patterns, not symbols. Over time, this silence becomes an essential part of deep rest. The brain learns to let go of language effortlessly, quickly picking it up again upon awakening. And so, as language quiets down, prediction dissolves, and slow plasticity continues its work, the brain remains immersed in that constant, uniform flow, moving forward without haste, linking one function to another, allowing sleep to sustain itself, without needing to be pointed out or understood.